The morning sky over Arlington was calm and golden, the kind of peaceful light that seemed to wrap the whole world in silence. Visitors gathered at the tomb of the unknown soldier, their voices fading to whispers as the familiar sound of steady footsteps echoed across the white marble. Each step was perfectly measured, each turn sharp and precise. Every movement spoke of honor, respect, and endless discipline. Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes moved like a shadow of duty. His uniform was spotless, his gloves bright white, his eyes fixed ahead. He had been a tomb guard for 3 years, and every single shift meant something deeply personal to him. To Daniel, this wasn't just a job. It was a promise to guard the memory of those who never came home. He had grown up in a small town in North Carolina, where his grandfather used to tell him stories about soldiers who gave everything and never got to rest under their own names. That thought always stayed in Daniel's heart. When he finally earned his place among the elite tomb guards, his family had traveled hundreds of miles just to see him take his first ceremonial march. Even now they came whenever they could. His father, mother, and younger sister often stood among the crowd, silently proud. That morning, Daniel's parents were there again, standing near the railing. His mother held her hands together as if in prayer, while his father filmed a few seconds quietly on his phone. The air was peaceful, almost too still. Even the sound of the flag moving slightly in the breeze seemed sacred. Daniel's mind was clear. Each step he took was practiced countless times, each second timed to perfection. The tomb guards are trained not just for precision but for endurance, for mental strength. They are taught that nothing, no distraction, no weather, no emotion, should break their focus while they guard the tomb. Among the crowd, tourists from different countries watched in awe. Some held their hats to their chests, others simply stood in silence. The reverence of the place touched everyone who visited. But that day, not every face in the crowd carried the same respect. Far behind the line of tourists, a man in a dark jacket moved differently. His hands were deep in his pockets, his eyes darting from one guard to another. He wore a black face covering that seemed out of place for the mild weather. A few visitors noticed him but assumed he was just shy or trying to stay out of the camera's view. Daniel, focused on his steps, noticed nothing. To him, every moment was a part of his sacred duty. The rhythm of his march continued, his polished shoes clicking lightly against the marble. The small group of soldiers nearby, including his partner, Sergeant Michael Ross, stood ready for rotation. Suddenly the mood shifted. A gust of wind swept through, carrying a strange energy with it. A few people in the crowd turned their heads as the man in the black jacket moved closer to the rail. His movements were quick, nervous. Something about him didn't fit the calmness of the place. Daniel turned at his mark, his rifle resting perfectly on his shoulder. As he made his next 21 steps, the crowd's unease grew. The man's eyes followed Daniel, every motion sharp and tense. Near the back, a veteran in his 70s, a man named Mr. Howard, watched carefully. He had served in Vietnam and visited the tomb every year on the same date. His instincts told him something wasn't right. Years of service had taught him to sense danger before it showed itself. Daniel reached his turning point again. He paused for exactly 21 seconds as tradition required. The world around him seemed frozen, the air thick with quiet. He had no idea that within seconds everything was about to change. The man in the mask reached into his jacket. Someone gasped softly and a few people stepped back. But before anyone could speak, the man pulled something out. It was small but glimmered under the sunlight. Daniel's parents noticed the sudden shift in the crowd, the fearful looks, the movement at the edge. His father's voice caught in his throat, but no sound came out. Time seemed to slow. Daniel, still facing forward, took another step, completely unaware of what was happening behind the rail. The masked man raised his arm. Some people shouted, others froze. Sergeant Ross, who stood just beyond the ceremonial line, noticed the movement instantly. Years of training kicked in, though his mind hadn't yet processed what was in the attacker's hand. In that suspended moment, the quietest place in America held its breath. The tomb stood still. The soldiers stood ready. The crowd stood frozen. Daniel's next step echoed like thunder in the silence. The sunlight flashed on something metallic as it cut through the air, but Daniel's discipline remained. He didn't flinch, didn't move. His training told him never to react to distractions, never to break formation. His world in that instant was only his duty. The crowd gasped, a sharp sound of shock breaking the stillness. Sergeant Ross took one quick step forward, his instincts firing. The motion was so fast, so fluid, that no one understood what they were seeing. The marble beneath Daniel's boots gleamed white and steady. His face was calm, his eyes ahead. The sacred silence of his post continued, unaware that fate itself had just bent around him. The visitors were caught between awe and fear, unsure if what they were witnessing was real. Mr. Howard, the old veteran, tightened his grip on the railing, whispering under his breath, "Not here. Not today." And then, for just a moment, everything froze. The guard, the crowd, and even the air. What happened next would be remembered by everyone who stood there that morning. But in that single heartbeat, it was only the calm before the storm. The man's arm was still extended, the object leaving his hand. The guard's boots were mid-step, the rifle gleaming. The crowd's gasps hung in the air, and as that instant stretched into eternity, one thing became clear. No one would ever forget the moment when danger came to the tomb and honor stood its ground. The knife cut through the air with frightening speed, shining for a brief second under the morning sun. The crowd gasped in disbelief. No one could have imagined that something like this could ever happen at such a sacred and quiet place. The tomb of the unknown soldier was known for peace and silence, but now it had turned into a scene of sudden danger. Daniel Hayes, the tomb guard, was still standing in position. His eyes remained fixed ahead, his body steady, his movements controlled. He had no idea that a blade was flying toward him. Years of discipline had trained him not to react to sudden noises or distractions. He didn't flinch, didn't turn his head, didn't even blink. To him, his duty was bigger than his fear. But only a few feet away, Sergeant Michael Ross saw everything happen. He was one of Daniel's fellow guards, waiting for his shift to begin. His sharp eyes caught the flash of silver in the air. For a fraction of a second, he froze. Then his instincts took over. Without thinking, Ross stepped forward and swung the ceremonial rifle in his hands. The heavy metal part of the rifle struck the knife midair, just before it could reach Daniel. The sound of metal hitting metal echoed across the marble ground like a bell. The blade flew off course and fell to the ground with a sharp clatter, spinning across the stone before stopping near Daniel's boots. The crowd erupted in shock. Some people screamed. Others backed away quickly. Daniel still did not move. His body stayed perfectly straight, his face expressionless, his eyes locked forward. His training told him to hold his ground no matter what. The tomb must always be guarded with complete honor, even in the face of danger. Sergeant Ross moved quickly now. His heart was racing, but his focus was clear. He turned toward the attacker, who had already started running. The masked man pushed through the crowd, trying to escape. People stumbled as he shoved past them. But the noise drew the attention of several nearby veterans. One of them was Mr. Howard, the elderly Vietnam veteran who had noticed the man earlier. Despite his age, his reflexes were sharp. As the attacker tried to rush past him, Mr. Howard stepped forward and caught the man's arm. The masked stranger tried to pull away, but Howard held on tightly. Another visitor, a middle-aged man wearing a veteran's cap, jumped in to help. Together, they tackled the man to the ground before he could get away. The crowd started to calm slightly, though the tension still hung heavy in the air. A few people moved closer, trying to see what had just happened, while others guided children back toward safety. Several guards ran in from nearby posts, surrounding the area quickly. The attacker struggled for a few seconds, then stopped as the soldiers restrained him. Through all of this, Daniel didn't move. He continued his slow, measured steps as if the world around him didn't exist. When he reached his mark, he paused, turned, and began walking again. His movements were smooth and precise, untouched by fear or confusion. The crowd watched him in awe. Even after facing danger, he stood tall, loyal to his oath. A woman in the front row wiped away tears. "He didn't even move," she whispered softly. "Not once." When the attacker was finally handcuffed, one of the guards picked up the fallen knife. It was small, sharp, and could have done real harm. The soldiers exchanged quiet looks, understanding how close the danger had come. Reporters and bystanders later said they had never seen anything like it. The calm of the guard, the speed of the response, and the courage of the people who stepped in. The video recordings from that day spread quickly online, showing Sergeant Ross's incredible reaction and the stillness of Daniel Hayes as the knife fell at his feet. As police led the masked man away, Mr. Howard leaned on his cane, breathing heavily. One of the younger soldiers came to thank him for helping. The old veteran smiled faintly and said, "I just did what any soldier would do." You don't let anyone dishonor this ground." His voice was steady, filled with pride and emotion. Meanwhile, Sergeant Ross walked back to his position, his heart still pounding. He looked toward Daniel, who was now finishing his precise march. For a brief second, their eyes met. Daniel gave the slightest nod, a quiet way of saying thank you. But neither man spoke. They both knew words weren't needed. Their duty spoke louder than anything they could say. A few moments later, the crowd began to settle again. Tourists whispered softly among themselves, realizing they had just witnessed something extraordinary. They weren't just watching soldiers. They were watching symbols of honor, courage, and calm strength. Daniel's parents, standing near the front, were still shaken. His mother held her husband's hand tightly. She had seen the knife fly through the air and had felt her heart stop. But now, seeing her son standing so strong, her fear slowly turned into pride. Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. When Daniel's shift finally ended, he stepped away from the ceremonial path with the same grace he always carried. Even then, he didn't speak about what had happened. The first thing he did was check on Sergeant Ross, who smiled and said, "Guess I was in the right place at the right time." Daniel simply replied, "You were exactly where duty put you." That short exchange said everything. They both knew that being a tomb guard wasn't just about standing still. It was about standing for something greater than themselves. Later, as the sun began to set over Arlington, a gentle peace returned to the tomb. The marble reflected soft shades of gold, and the flag above moved gently in the evening breeze. Visitors who remained spoke quietly, their respect deeper than before. No one there would forget that day. They had seen fear turn to courage, chaos turn to discipline, and danger turn to silence. They had seen how duty, when carried with true honor, could stand unshaken even when tested by the unexpected. Daniel Hayes walked past the tomb one last time before leaving his post. He stopped for a moment, placed his hand on his heart, and looked toward the stone that represented all unknown heroes. He didn't think about the danger, the fear, or the knife. He thought only about the promise he had made, to guard this place no matter what. The night air was calm again, and for the tomb guard, the silence of duty remained unbroken. The sun rose quietly over Arlington the next morning, casting long golden lines over the white marble of the tomb. The air felt calm again, but something in the atmosphere had changed. The story of the masked attacker and the brave guards had already spread far beyond the cemetery gates. News channels, newspapers, and social media were filled with words like courage, discipline, and honor. People everywhere were talking about the moment when a tomb guard faced danger, but never moved an inch. Daniel Hayes woke up early, as he always did. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his shoes polished until they reflected light. He didn't see himself as a hero. To him, he was just doing what he had promised, guarding those who could no longer guard themselves. Yet the world now looked at him differently. Reporters wanted interviews. His photo was on the front pages, and messages of praise poured in from around the country. But Daniel stayed quiet. He wasn't comfortable with attention. He believed the focus should always stay on the unknown soldiers, not on him. When his commander asked him if he was ready to stand guard again, Daniel answered simply, "Sir, I never stopped." Later that morning, he returned to the tomb in full uniform. The crowd was larger than usual. Many had come after hearing about the event. There were veterans with medals on their jackets, families holding small American flags, and even schoolchildren carrying flowers. The silence was thicker now, not out of fear, but out of deep respect. Sergeant Michael Ross stood beside Daniel before the ceremony began. He smiled and said softly, "You know, they're all here to see you." Daniel shook his head slightly. "They're here to remember them," he said, nodding toward the tomb. "That's how it should be." When Daniel stepped into position, the air seemed to still completely. The first sound of his boots against the marble echoed through the space. Every person there stood silently, some with hands over their hearts, some with tears in their eyes. His movements were the same as always, slow, precise, perfect. Nothing about his performance had changed, but the meaning behind it had grown even stronger. Among the crowd stood Mr. Howard, the elderly veteran who had helped stop the attacker. He leaned on his cane, watching with pride. The event had taken a toll on him physically. but he wouldn't have missed this day for anything. He looked at Daniel with a gentle smile and whispered to himself, "That's how soldiers stand, tall and unbroken." When the ceremony ended, Daniel stepped off the path and returned to the small resting area behind the tomb. Several officers approached him, shaking his hand. They praised his calmness and dedication. One of them said, "You showed the whole country what real discipline looks like." Daniel thanked them but didn't speak much. His words were few, but his actions had already said everything. Later that day, a small ceremony was held in private to honor those who had acted bravely. Sergeant Ross received special recognition for his quick reaction, and the veterans who helped stop the attacker were invited as guests of honor. When Daniel's name was mentioned, he stepped forward only to salute, then quietly returned to his place. The applause that followed was gentle, filled with respect rather than celebration. Reporters waiting outside tried to get a few words from him. One asked, "How did you stay so calm when you were in danger?" Daniel looked at her for a moment and replied, "Because my duty doesn't change no matter what happens. My job is to stand guard, and that's what I did." His voice was steady, humble, and sincere. That single line spread across the nation, quoted in headlines and shared on countless posts online. In the days that followed, messages of gratitude poured in from everywhere. Families of fallen soldiers wrote letters saying how much the story had moved them. School children sent handmade cards, many of them with drawings of guards standing tall beside the tomb. Daniel read every message quietly, often placing them near his locker as reminders of why his duty mattered. The man who had attacked was taken into custody and faced justice, but Daniel never asked about him. He didn't want to fill his heart with anger or hate. He believed the only thing that mattered was that the tomb remained untouched and the silence unbroken. Weeks passed, and the attention began to fade, but something lasting had changed in the hearts of those who visited the tomb. People now came not just to watch, but to truly understand. They saw that the guard's stillness wasn't just a rule. It was a symbol of respect so deep that even danger couldn't move it. One evening, Daniel returned to the tomb alone after his shift. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft orange and pink colors. The cemetery was quiet, with only the sound of leaves moving in the wind. He stood before the stone again, his cap in his hand, and whispered softly, "It's still safe. Always will be." At that moment, Sergeant Ross walked up beside him. They stood together in silence for a while. Then Ross said, "You know, people keep calling what happened a miracle." Daniel smiled faintly. "Maybe it was," he said, "but I think it was duty doing what it's supposed to do. Protect." They both looked toward the horizon where the flag waved gently above the tomb. The calmness returned, the same calmness that had existed before the chaos. For them, it was more than just peace. It was a reminder that courage often hides in quiet hearts, and true strength doesn't always need words or noise. When Daniel left the grounds that evening, he walked past a group of visitors arriving late. A little boy tugged at his mother's hand and whispered, "Mom, is that the soldier who didn't move when the bad man came?" His mother nodded softly and smiled. Daniel heard the words but didn't turn. He simply gave a small nod of respect as he walked by. Back at home, Daniel placed his uniform carefully on its hanger, cleaned his shoes, and sat by the window. Outside, the night sky was calm. He thought about his fellow guards, about Sergeant Ross, about Mr. Howard, and about all the unknown heroes resting under the ground he protected. He didn't feel like a hero himself. He felt like a small part of something much greater, something eternal. The next morning, he was back at his post again. The same steps, the same silence, the same discipline. The crowd watched quietly, many not knowing the full story of what had happened weeks before. But Daniel didn't need them to know. What mattered was that the tomb stood guarded, the promise unbroken. As the day went on, the sound of his footsteps echoed through the marble corridor once more, steady, strong, and sure. It was a sound that spoke without words, a sound that said, honor never falls, duty never hesitates, and courage can live even in silence. And in that silence, the tomb of the unknown soldier remained forever protected by men who believed that some promises are worth keeping with every step they take.